Mr. Gardner, and after Mr. Gardner is Ms. Mannion. Mr. Gardner.
Good afternoon, Chairman Eisenberg and council members. Thank you very much for the opportunity to comment. I will really try to be brief here. And it's Charles Gardner of the Delta Vision Foundation. As you know, the Delta Vision Foundation was formed to monitor and report on the progress of state agencies, stakeholders, federal agencies, and others in implementing the principles, actions, strategies, goals identified in the Delta Vision Strategic Plan. The Delta Plan is a key component of the implementation of that strategic plan. I'm going to focus my comments on the Delta Plan and not on the EIR or the regulations. Like Mr. Edgar, we are not interested in interrupting your process. We are trying to be constructive and help ensure that the Delta Plan is a successful document and process for implementing the Delta Vision Strategic Plan. In looking at the final draft Delta Plan, we really stepped back to look to see how effective is it as a policy and planning document for achieving the two co-equal goals and implementing the Delta Vision Strategic Plan. And that really is, does it effectively describe this wicked problem in the Delta and the challenges and conflicts associated with that? And I think in that area it does a very good job. I actually still, every time I read it, I learn something new about the problems in the Delta or how current management works. So I think it's very effective at that, and it's relatively concise, which is hard to do. The second question is really, does it set the state on a path to success that is fundamentally different from prior plans? We've been around this loop several times of developing plans and then trying to implement them and then going back and developing more plans. So let me provide some overall comments and then I'll drill down briefly. I think as I mentioned, I think it's very effective at describing the problem, the history of the conditions, current management, and the challenges. I think it does a decent job of identifying strategies that are needed in each resource area to address the problems. However, I think there's more work that can be done to describe a fundamentally different management strategy that would lead to more effective implementation. And I think that's specifically in some areas related to performance management, the linkages and integration, and near-term actions. So we looked at those areas specifically, near-term actions, linkages and integration, performance management. We also looked at and compared the strategies and actions in the Delta Vision Strategic Plan with the set of policies and recommendations and other actions in the Delta Plan. And I'll touch on a couple of things there. And then we're also looking at the funding and financing, which we'll submit some written comments on. In terms of the near-term actions, overall, our sense continues to be that the Delta Plan does not communicate yet a sense of urgency. I know that the council feels a sense of urgency, and I know that staff does, and stakeholders as well. There's a level of frustration about implementation. And I think this is an area where some relatively minor improvements in the Delta Plan could communicate that sense of urgency and really start to advance things. We looked at the 91 policies, recommendations, and council actions that are in the Delta Plan and Appendix C, and looked to see what type of action they directed. Notably, that of those 91, 52 of them are about additional plans and studies, administration and governance, or monitoring. They're not about actually doing and changing things. They're about more studying and more monitoring. Only 9 of the policies and recommendations are about physical or operational changes in the Delta. That's 10%. And so I think that from a broad perspective, sends a message that we need to look more at what are some near-term things that we can do that actually would change conditions out there. There are 21 that are about developing or implementing new regulations. As far as I can tell, there are no recommendations about pilot projects that are either underway or should be initiated. So that would be an area where I think that the Delta Plan could highlight some near-term things that either are already underway to address these problems or could be very shortly. I didn't see any recommendations or discussion about existing regulations, where those could be enforced more effectively. And so I think that's another area that would communicate some urgency, some action in the near term. The other observation about the policies and recommendations is only a third of them have actual deadlines associated with them. I can certainly understand the policies wouldn't have deadlines, but there are 71 recommendations that only about a third of them have specific deadlines. So that too would create more of a sense of urgency if we were putting things on timelines. There's a good initial effort to identify the 13 priority actions that are listed in Chapter 1. But I think there can be more emphasis of, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to be a priority action? And I don't think it takes a lot to add a few things to the Delta Plan. Let me move on to linkages. I think that the Delta Plan continues to improve in communicating the linkages and integration that are really needed to solve these problems. Clearly, the document as a whole and each chapter acknowledges and describes the two co-equal goals and how they're relevant for that subject area, and I think that's really been a big improvement. But I think that an area where we need to focus, and I'll touch on this in a couple of different ways, is the objectives of the plan. At the top level, I think the plan needs a more specific and even measurable set of objectives of how do we achieve the co-equal goals and protecting and preserving the delta as place. Those discussions of the objectives are either broadly designed as vision statements or they're put in sidebars. And I think more specific objectives would, and defining those objectives in an integrated and linked way, and I'll give you one example and we'll submit some more. But the concept of diverting more water in wet years and less in dry years, that is an integrated objective that achieves both water supply reliability and ecosystem restoration. So those kinds of objectives at the top level would help align all of the different interests who will pick at different parts of the plan on a common purpose. Let me talk about performance management, because it is a big focus of our effort across this whole Delta issue, and it's going to be a substantial portion of our comments. That I think this is an area where some minor changes to the Delta Plan could set the Delta Plan in a new direction. And I think performance management is maybe the only tool that hasn't been tried effectively to solve the Delta problem. We've tried legal approaches, we've tried executive fiat, we've tried collaborative processes, but we haven't really implemented a true performance management approach that has the kind of objectivity, transparency, and reporting that will hold everybody accountable for results. So I think this is an area that appears to be more of an afterthought in the Delta Plan, and I think there's a few specific areas that I think could really improve. That the adaptive management section, I think, is a good start. But when I talk about performance management, I mean more broadly than adaptive management. That it is applying to organizational performance as well as environmental performance. So I mentioned the need for top-level objectives. I would say throughout, and your adaptive management approach acknowledges that clear, measurable objectives are a fundamental part of implementing adaptive management, and I would totally agree. And you provide some examples in the adaptive management sidebars. But the Delta plan itself doesn't have those kind of clear measurable objectives at the top level or in each chapter. So we have vision statements, we have some policies and recommendations, we have some strategies, but we don't really define what are we trying to achieve in each issue area and how are we going to measure our progress to it. So therefore, the performance measures aren't tied to anything specific and measurable. So they also appear as an afterthought. We actually did a side-by-side comparison of the performance measures identified in the Delta Vision Strategic Plan with those in the Delta Plan. And it's pretty easy to see that I think you would have been better off of just bringing those forward from the Delta Vision Strategic Plan and putting them as examples, because they're very clear, they're very succinct, they're tied to specific goals and strategies, and the current performance measures, some of them aren't even measurable in any logical way. For example, when we're talking in Chapter 7 about reducing risk, the performance measure is no lives lost, which we could only measure after there were a catastrophe. So it's impossible to measure progress towards that goal, or that doesn't measure progress or accomplishment, except after the fact. The last thing I would say about performance measures is that it's an area where I think there is an inadequate commitment by the Council to action in this area. There is I think it's a Council action in Appendix C to do a report on performance measures. But I think a more concerted commitment as to how you will develop, implement, and track and report on the performance measures would really help the plan. And I really do think that all of these things could be addressed quite simply. They wouldn't disrupt your environmental review process or your regulatory process. But it would communicate more clearly that there's a sense of urgency and there's a sense of accountability in how we implement solutions. And then lastly, let me just touch on the long-term implementation. A couple of iterations of the Delta Plan, we have compared the Delta Plan with the Delta Vision Strategic Plan, and I would be remiss if I didn't highlight a couple of things that I think are still missing in the Delta Plan, although they may be a little harder to fix on the time frame you're on. First, there appear to be no policies or recommendations related to reducing fish losses, either by improving fish migration corridors, reducing entrainment losses, or other actions. There is one recommendation related to predation, sort of indirectly related to predation. But I think this is an area, and maybe the strategy is deferring to BDCP, is that they're going to fix the fish problems, but I don't think that's the appropriate strategy with the Delta Plan. I think that there could be more attention and focus on even near-term things, pilot studies and programs, or various things that could more specifically address fish losses. And then second, I think the area of water quality and salinity management is another one where the policies and recommendations, actually there are no policies, the recommendations focus on regulatory action, which is certainly an important part of the mix. The actions by state board and the regional boards is certainly important. But there have, until very recently, been a number of studies or investigations of either operational or physical changes in the Delta that could improve salinity management, barriers. I think there's a whole host of things that we could be looking at in that area, and those physical or operational changes just don't appear in the Delta Plan. So with that, I will conclude and send you more detailed comments on Monday.
Gardner, thank you.